The title is Jesus Remain. I would like to ask Brother Trey to come forward.
So, good morning to all. Always kind of odd to be up here and say good morning to all and imagine just a couple of people here. But we know that there are others, even around the world, that are also with. So, we are glad to have you with us today. So, the title is Jesus Remains. You might have different thoughts in your mind about what that means. But what I'm going to talk about this morning is the fact that when everyone else might abandon us, Jesus stays, that he remains with us. There may have been a time in your life when no one wants to be around you. Something you did or said or some action that you took. As a child, you might remember this happening, that all your friends hated you for one reason or other. Maybe because you, I don't know, did something in a athletic contest when playing around with your friends that was really a bad thing to do, whatever it was. You may have noticed that they didn't want to talk to you for a while. When we get older, we tend to make more serious mistakes that cause people to scatter from us, not want to talk to us. And it can be very serious. And maybe we feel like, well, we actually deserve this kind of treatment because of whatever we have done. We can make mistakes that will mark us for life. They can put a mark on us, a stigma, so to speak, that stays with us for the rest of our lives. And we know people like that. We know people like that in the meeting that have done something that causes us to want to separate from them, keep them in a different spot, to stay away from these certain people. If it isn't you, you might know someone like that, that people just don't want to be around. And sometimes it's people that have gone to jail. Sometimes it's people that have ruined their marriage. Sometimes it's just people that you have disagreed with, that you just want to stay away from. Sometimes it's very subtle things, some very small thing that someone has done, but you still want to avoid these people. These people, just like Cain, have been marked, and we just want to stay away from them. And in the case of Cain, even if you wanted to go kill him, you couldn't. You just have to kind of avoid him. Let him wander in the earth in shame. And that's what happens to some people that we know. They are just there and they're in shame, sitting strange situation. But how is Jesus different then? Well, every example that I can think of, in fact, I had a hard time weeding out the examples I want to talk about this morning because he never does that. Jesus never does that. He never shuns people. Even people that come to the conclusion that they deserve to be shunned, he doesn't. He still stays with them. He remains. And you can think of all of your examples. We'll go through a few this morning. Jesus is the example of someone who stays. It's like I can remember when I was in sports contests. It's always great when you're the hero in sports. And I was only in sports when I was young. But it's great to be carried on people's shoulders and do things that everybody is glad that you won the game or somehow contributed. That can happen once in a while. Some people it happens often. Some people it never happens to, that they're the hero. But it certainly is difficult when you're the GOAT, when you're the one that loses the game or has contributes to the loss or does something stupid during a game. And the only people that want to be around you after that has happened are like your parents. They'll come up and give you a hug and say, that's okay. Most of your teammates and stuff want to avoid you for a while. But Jesus is like your parents in those situations. He's the one that stays and consoles you or tells you where you need to go from there. But he doesn't abandon you. Let's look as our first example of what I'm trying to get at this morning is Luke chapter 5. This is the episode of when Peter was being called by Jesus. In the right book here. Luke chapter 5, and if you'll recall, Jesus got in Peter's boat and pushed off from shore and spoke to the people. And then after it was over, he told Peter to go out and fish. And Peter was kind of resisting. He said, we fished all night and didn't catch anything. So it's kind of pointless, but if you say so, we'll do it. And of course, when they did, they caught a whole bunch of fish. And this was shocking to Peter, and he started to realize who this man Jesus was. So, in verse 8, it says, but when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he was astonished, and all that were with him, at the catch of fish which they had taken. So when they see all this, they said, this is a miraculous thing that happened. Because we were fishing all night and nothing was out there. And now we have so many fish that the boats are sinking because of the load that they have. So at this, Peter realizes that Jesus is calling him, and he kind of responds with, look, I'm not your man. If you knew who I was, you wouldn't call me. I'm a sinner, so just go away, because you'll be sorry that you picked me. And we don't know why Peter would say this. What happened in his life, I have no idea, prior to being a follower of Jesus. But he has this reaction that I'm not the one you want. You shouldn't want me because I'm a sinner. So if you knew who I was, if you knew what I did in my past, you wouldn't want me. I think that's the point of what Peter's saying here. But what does Jesus do? He remains. He stays with Peter and says, yes, I want you. In fact, as Peter finds out, excuse me, later in his life, Jesus knows everything about him. He knows even what he's going to do in the future, whether good or bad. So that's kind of the point I'm getting at this morning. That's the kind of examples we're looking at. People who think, I don't think Jesus would really want to be around me if he knew who I was. And so now let's look at Luke 7, just a couple chapters ahead. And this is the story of Jesus going to dinner at the Pharisee's house, Simon the Pharisee. And we know what happens there as well. A woman comes in, anoints Jesus' feet, cries on Jesus' feet. She also has an alabaster jar of anointing oil. And she cries, wipes his feet with his hair. But it says specifically that this woman is a sinner, that she's been branded, that she has a mark on her. And everybody knows she's a sinner, except apparently Jesus, who they marvel at, that his ignorance of the situation. So in verse 40, jump in. Well, we'll look at verse 39. Now, when the Pharisees who had invited him saw it, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. That's especially like in these days, you can't even shake hands because someone might have coronavirus, whatever. But that's what this is, of course, even more serious, I think, that they have branded this woman and said if he knew who she was, he wouldn't be letting her touch him. But of course, Jesus did know. He knew exactly who she was, and he knew exactly who these people were, Pharisees, who Simon was. And I think that's a very important point to us. He went into this meal. I think he actually knew that this woman was going to show up, and he makes a point of the whole situation with the Pharisees at that dinner with him. And he tells a parable about someone who has been forgiven much, loves much. So Jesus did know, and even though he did know, he remained, right? And he remained not only with the woman he knew was a sinner, but he stayed there with her. He knew who the Pharisees were, and he stayed with them and gave them a chance to understand who he was and what God's plan was with them. Jesus stays if you invite him, and even sometimes if you don't invite him, he will remain with you until you understand as much as you can what his plan is for you. But that is an interesting episode because they said this guy doesn't even know. If he were the prophet sent by God, he would know that this woman is a sinner. But of course, he is a prophet and he does know who she is, and yet he remains. Now let's look at John chapter 4. Again, a woman, this time the woman at the well in Sychar, which is the Samaritan city. Again, I'm just gonna summarize the story because I think we know it well. There's a woman as Jesus is traveling to get away from Jerusalem. He's going up north, and they pass through this Samaritan city, and he sends his disciples into the closest town to get food. which is Sychar, and she is at the well with him, and they have a conversation. And there's obvious reasons to her why they should not be having this conversation. In fact, she says those to Jesus. In verse 9, it says, the Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? So there's two obvious reasons that she thinks he should not be talking to her, or that he should be avoiding her, that she's a Samaritan and that she's a woman. Why would he be talking to her? That's what's going through her mind. Never even considering what Jesus might know about her personal life. She thinks there's obvious reasons that she should be shunned by a Jew. But as the conversation goes on, Jesus remains. He keeps talking to her, and they get into more serious conversations. Then she's starting to realize that this man might be someone very important, that he may in fact be the Messiah. And she ends up going back to the town of Sychar where she lives and telling the people that. So here's the other interesting thing. I think we've read this many times, this story, probably. But in verse 28, it says, so the woman left her water jar and went away into the city and said to the people, come, see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? They went out of the city and were coming to him. So I think it's an important thing here, again, that she says, he told me all that I ever did. And I think the implied statement after that is that, and he still stayed here. He still remained. He told me all he knew about my life, things that I might have been ashamed of, and yet he's still there. Jesus remained. The disciples, when they saw what was happening, that he was talking with her, they were astonished that he was talking to this Samaritan woman. So they obviously would have probably been among those who would have avoided her, that would have gone around her, not talked to her at the well. But Jesus remains. And in fact, he remains in the city for a few days in order to talk to all the people there. Jesus remains with the people that others would avoid, that others would shun. So sometimes we think, well, yeah, if he really knew, he knows about my life, he would not want to be around me because he's perfect. Jesus has never committed sin, but yet he does. In fact, he goes out of his way to remain with people that others would shun. One more example is in John chapter 9. And this is the man born blind. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but here's a man that's been blind his whole life. We don't know how old he is right now. But we do know that his parents are still alive. And he does what Jesus says. He walks as a blind man to the pool and cleanses his eyes from the spit and mud that Jesus put on them. And now he can see for the first time. he can see. So he's experiencing sight, seeing people that he's only heard, and marveling at this newfound ability to see that he's just acquired. He saw his parents for the first time. He saw all these people that maybe had tossed money into his coin collector to help him out as a blind man. He saw all of them for the first time. And now he's seeing, I think he's seen some ugly people for the first time as well. Some people that are willing to shun him, but he stands up for the person, Jesus, who healed him this whole time. So this is a person that's being shunned for no good reason, really. The only reason they're shunning him is because of who healed him. But he stands up to all of them, and eventually, let's look at verse 31, where he confesses Jesus pretty much without knowing who he is exactly. He says in verse 31, we know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. So they shunned him. They cast him out, and there was no good reason for it. He gave an honest confession, and what he said was the truth. And I think this is important, what happens next. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who speaks to you. Which is an interesting statement, but I think the first thing I want to concentrate on is that the Pharisees cast him out, and as soon as Jesus heard that they cast him out, that he was shunned, that he was pushed aside, he went to him. Which is kind of like the opposite of our reaction in most cases, I think. When we hear someone is cast out, we want to know why, and is there good reason for it? Maybe we should shun this person as well. But that's not Jesus' reaction. He immediately, when he hears that he was cast out, he goes to him. And I think it's a great thing, too, that he says to him, you have seen the Son of Man. Well, when did he see him? He hasn't really ever seen him until Jesus walks up to him at that point. But he says, I think he's saying, even though you were blind, you did see him. Because you understood the power of faith. And when I asked you to go and wash your eyes, you did it. So in a sense, he had already seen Jesus, even though he had not seen him with his eyes physically. And I think that also is a good lesson that, could have been anybody that came up to him. How's it going? You okay? Meaning that it doesn't matter what Jesus actually looks like if you have seen him with your mind, that you can see a vision of who this man is exactly. I think that's important for us. Being on both sides of that, we can kind of take the place of Jesus as being a comfort to people who have been cast out. And Sean, it doesn't matter what we look like if we are carrying on what Jesus would do. So Jesus remained, and he remained in the area till all this was resolved with the blind man. And then when the blind man was cast out, he was no longer blind, then Jesus approached him. I'm still here. The one that did this for you, I am here, and I am speaking to you. So it was a great comfort for that man, I believe, who was just, his whole world had been opened up, and some of the things that he saw with his new eyes were not very pleasant. Okay, the final example I'm going to talk about is the crucifixion of Jesus. And let's look at Luke for that. Luke 23. And as we know, he had a man on either side of him when he was crucified. And I think what happens here is pretty much amazing. We know as it starts out, that he's being mocked. And partially it appears by these men that are on either side of him. Although I think they were somewhat serious. Because they tell him, if you are who you say you are, then get down off this cross and take us with you. And Jesus doesn't. He remains there. You would say, well, of course he has to remain there. He's on the cross. He has no other options. At this point, he's there on the cross, and he has to stay there. But I think that's what dawns in the one thief's mind, that he doesn't have to be there, that Jesus does not have to be on that cross. But he does, because he knows, well, for one thing, Jesus could have gotten out of this situation. We know at his trial, just a couple of words, or Jesus could have parted the crowd like he always did and just went his way. But he didn't. At any point, he says, I could call down angels from heaven and they would save me. But he never does. And if Jesus had decided to use the power of God to get down off the cross, the thing was, he couldn't take those thieves with him, right? Because they deserved their fate. Only he could have gotten down. Only he was the one that deserved, he did not deserve to be on the cross. He deserved something much better, but he remains. And I think that the one thief figures this out after a while. He stayed. He stayed on the cross even though he didn't have to. And in let's look at verse 39 of Luke 23. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, when you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we, indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So I think it dawned on this man eventually that Jesus could have gotten down, but he remained. He remained there even knowing who they were and who we are. Jesus remains. He stays for our benefit. So, like I said, every example that I could think of in the Bible is Jesus staying with someone. The woman caught in adultery, Zacchaeus, centurion, go on and on. Any example that you can think of, Jesus stays with people who are sinners for one reason or another. Every example. Even if you try to think of one, and I might say, well, the woman that said, oh, even the dogs eat the bread, he wasn't going to stay with her, but he was, I think. He went up there specifically to find her, I believe. So if every example is like that, why do we tend to do the opposite? I mean, this talk is mainly about how it affects us personally, how we can be sure that Jesus remains with us, even though we are sinners, even though we do things wrong, even though sometimes we self-inflict banishment. Jesus wants us to come to him. He says, come to me, as Masi read this morning, come to me, all you are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So I want you to remember that personally, but why do we treat other people when Jesus runs to people that have been cast out, the people that are banished? When he goes to aid them and comfort them, why do we do the opposite sometimes? Why do we think it's our job to banish people, to cast them aside? It's a very strange thing, and I'm not saying I'm innocent of doing that, because I'm not. Of thinking about people in my mind that are lesser brother or sister. There's no such thing, really, not in Jesus' eyes. Every example is of him remaining with people, even though he knows who they are, though he knows what they will do. And certainly Peter's life is like that. Several times in his life, he probably thought Jesus would no longer be with him, but he stayed with Jesus as well. He said at one point, where else can we go? He might give us hard sayings, but where else can we go? You have the keys of eternal life. You are the one, you're the only one, as far as Peter knew, that could offer such things. You know, I was talking to a sister recently about the expression, got your back. And that's an expression that's used, I think it comes from like military or somebody that says, you know, you're going into a difficult situation. Maybe some person is really trying to get their little group out of a jam, and some are behind them. And they're saying, like, if it gets really difficult, if it gets hot and heavy, don't worry, I'm not going to run off. I have your back. It's as if you can depend on me to defend you from behind. Like, nobody's going to sneak up on you, because I'm not going to run off and leave your back exposed. And so we take that as an expression, I've got your back, means I'm going to stay with you no matter where this difficult situation you're in leads. And it's interesting that we don't do that much. I mean, a lot of times when things get difficult for someone, we don't say, don't worry, I've got your back. We say, leave and never come back, right? That's what we're kind of thinking. But that's not Jesus' example. His example is to remain. Well, let's go back briefly to Cain and talk about what happened with him. I mean, he had a mark. So you might say God specifically marked him so that people would avoid him and shun him. But really, that wasn't God's doing, was it? It was Cain's doing. He said, I'm afraid that what you punish me with is greater than I can bear. I can't be a wanderer. And even if I am, I'll wander around and people will find me and then kill me. So this is a punishment I can't bear. And God said, well, that's the way you think, then I'll put a mark on you. And anybody that people will be afraid to kill you because I will punish them. So he pretty much asked for the mark on him. I don't think God wanted to necessarily give him that mark. Maybe God did want him to say, like the thief on the cross, what any punishment that God gives me, I deserve. I deserve to be here. And I think that's all God asks from us as well. That we just admit who we are and what we have done, and just know that God and His Son remain with us. Because that's not their purpose, to find sin in us and to avoid it, because they know we are sinners. Their mission, Jesus' mission, by every example that He gives, is to remain with us. And so today, when we remember Jesus, as our brother Dan said, this is the day most Christian churches celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And we do as well. We do this every week. But Jesus, it's evidence that Jesus remains with us. Even when we come to this table, He remains with us. And that is the greatest evidence of all. And that's what I want you to think about as you take this bread and wine. This is evidence that Jesus remains with us.